If Will Smith had never slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars the other night, I never would have known the movie King Richard existed, and I never would have watched it. So I guess in some bizarre, strange, roundabout 21st century sort of way, the Oscars have performed their original intended function, which was to bring greater public exposure to the best movies of the year. And King Richard is a fantastic motion picture. I only watched it out of morbid curiosity after the slapping incident, and if I'm being honest, I fully expected it to be a fat slab of race-huckstering garbage, because it seems that's what all movies are about black people these days. Not only is this movie not that, but this movie, and the real-life story of the Williams family itself, drives a stake through the heart of the currently fashionable narrative that says all black Americans are systemically disadvantaged and have no prospect of extricating themselves from the morass of poverty and homelessness and despair without the intervention of their benevolent white saviors in the Democrat Party. If there's any message one takes away from this film, it's that the American dream is very much a real thing. It is accessible to everyone, irrespective of the circumstances of their birth, and the only limitations on it are the talent and work ethic of the individual. This is also far and away the best performance of Will Smith's career. We don't think of Will Smith as a character actor. We think of him as a guy who mostly just plays Will Smith. The only other role he's played that's a comparable stretch into the realm of character acting was when he played Muhammad Ali. And he did the best he could in that picture. It was a fine performance, but as a viewer, you never forgot it was Will Smith you were looking at and not Ali because, let's face it, there is no physical resemblance between the two men and they have completely different voices. This picture is different. Will Smith disappears into Richard Williams. By the second half of the film, you have to remind yourself this is Will Smith you're watching, and the physical performance wasn't even the challenging part. Getting the voice right, that was the challenge. Richard Williams is a black man born in the Deep South during the Second World War, and his manner of speech reflects his origins, as all people's manner of speech does. He speaks the dialect of Southern African American vernacular English. He says women's and people's and feats and uses all of those wonderfully weird conjugations, and he's never made any attempt to mask his origins by changing his manner of speech, and this is a real challenge for the actor. If you get the voice and the manner of speech wrong just a little bit, it might come off sounding like a parody or a pastiche. And the fact that it never does is a reflection of the number of hours and days that Will Smith must have spent working to get it right and to make it convincing. So it really is an incredible damn shame that in one moment of unthinking stupidity, Will Smith cheapened his greatest performance. He debased himself as a man. Furthermore, he debased this film and Richard Williams and the Williams family. This movie is now going to be defined forever, not in terms of its own undeniably high quality, but as a film that is associated with Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars, and that sucks. I think this is a great movie. I think it's an important movie, and I have much more to say about it. So let's hit the music and get the show on the road. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where April Fool's Day isn't just a date, it's a state of mind. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I am a big believer in the idea that if you want to take the true measure of a man, the best way to do it is by getting to know his kids. And while there are, to be sure, some enigmatic and rather unsavory aspects to Richard Williams' life, if we're measuring the man by the character and the qualities of his offspring, then Richard Williams is both a great American and a really good dad. He is also, crucially, a man who never stopped believing in the American dream and in his own ability to achieve it, even though it would have been perfectly understandable if he didn't. Black people born in the Deep South 80 years ago have experienced things that most of us can scarcely even imagine, and the movie deals with some of that. Regrettably, though, it does not deal, except for one brief passing mention, with the fact that Richard Williams had a first family that he basically walked out on and abandoned before he met his second wife, the future mother of Venus and Serena. This is what makes the guy such an enigmatic character, but all we see in the film is him being a lovely father to Venus and Serena and his 3 stepdaughters. Since the film functions mainly as a character study of Richard Williams himself, that seems to me a fairly huge aspect of his life to be only mentioning once in passing. Now, how much of his devotion and attentiveness to his second family arose out of guilt over the fact that he was a deadbeat dad to his first family? That has to be a pretty big part of the equation, right? How could it not be? But that's really my only complaint about the structure of the narrative. My other complaint is that there's this one line very late in the movie that is completely wrong and never would have been uttered by someone living in 1994. Richard Williams is in the tunnel. Venus is about to play her second pro match against Arantxa Sanchez Vicario, and Bud Collins goes by, the old NBC tennis commentator, and he starts chatting with Richard. As he's walking away, Collins says, "Wow, if your 14-year-old daughter actually beats the #1 player in the world, forget about Ali Frazier. That's the biggest upset in the history of sports." All right. Time out. Pump the brakes there, Mr. Screenwriter. We got to talk about this. First of all, there was no upset in any of the 3 Ali Frazier fights, much less the biggest upset in the history of sports. In the first fight, Frazier was the reigning champion, he was favored to win, and he won. In the second 2 fights, Ali was the reigning champion, he was favored to win, and he won. So already it's a very incongruous line, but it's made worse by the fact that it is spoken by a character in 1994, because that is a mere 4 years after Buster Douglas knocked Mike Tyson on his ass in Tokyo in what was the actual greatest upset in the history of sports, and which was still fresh in everyone's mind in the mid-1990s. I mean, sure, it probably sounds like a trifling complaint, but it really landed with a thud for me coming right at the end of a film that I'd really enjoyed, and which had done a better than usual job of depicting the 1990s as they actually were, as opposed to what we normally get from Hollywood, which is just a bunch of sight gags and nostalgia porn. Hey, look at the Walkman, remember those? Hey, everybody's wearing teal and purple, remember when everybody wore teal and purple? Hey, look at the guy with the mullet, remember mullets? Weren't mullets funny? Now, I guess this happens to everybody as they age, but it's always strange when times through which you lived and of which you have a detailed memory are depicted on screen in a way that's completely divorced from what the actual reality was. This movie doesn't do that, and that is to the credit of the filmmakers, because if they had gone down the 90s nostalgia rabbit hole, it would have just been a needless distraction from the story and the performances. I did not have much in the way of expectations for this picture when I decided to watch it. I freely admit, again, it was just curiosity arising from the Oscar incident. I expected a heavily fictionalized version of the story of the Williams family viewed through the lens of 21st century racial grievance because, let's face it, that is the only way that the Hollywood of the 2020s knows how to tell stories about black Americans. So even if the story is set 30, 50, 80, 100 years in the past, the characters always sound like they should be sitting in the faculty lounge at Boston University helping Henry Rogers... Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, count the stacks of money he's taken off dumb, incredulous, self-loathing white liberals this week. So it's really rather shocking that a movie like this could even be made at all in the year 2022, a movie that is blissfully free of any current-day race politics. That's not to say race isn't a component of the story, because it very much is. This is a story, after all, of 2 black little girls from Compton trying to establish themselves and rise to prominence in a nearly all-white sport. And I need to do a quick aside here, because I think there's a common perception, especially among younger people, that the Williams sisters are the first wildly successful black players in the history of women's tennis, but that is not so. Althea Gibson was the best player in the world in the second half of the 1950s. She won 5 Grand Slam titles, and Zina Garrison was still a top 10 level player when Venus and Serena first turned pro. So it's not correct to say they were the first, but it is correct to say they were and are the first top-flight professionals to emerge from a traditionally non-tennis background. And if Mr. Williams were here right now, he'd probably say, "What you trying to say is, we black, and we from the ghetto." Frankly, I don't think Richard Williams has ever gotten enough credit for how funny he is, or enough credit for his skill at getting people to underestimate him, which is one of the most valuable skills you can possess in this life. And I think this movie's script and Will Smith's performance did a good job of reflecting that side of him. He was perfectly self-aware about the fact that at these junior tennis tournaments, the sight of a black family of 7 was something that caused more than a few heads to turn. And when that happened, Richard Williams would make some crack like, "Sorry, we was just trying to find our way back to the ghetto. We be out of here in a sec." And that is freaking hilarious. What better way is there to allay racial tensions than by cracking a funny joke at your own expense? But today, in the race-huckstering 2020s, black people are told they mustn't act like that. You can't joke about racism. Racism is serious business. You're supposed to internalize all those grievances and perceived slights and turn them into pure hatred for whitey, because hating whitey is the thing that will set you free. Except it isn't, of course. The Democrat Party has been peddling that snake oil to black Americans for over 60 years now, and it isn't designed to improve black people's lives. It's designed to keep them voting Democrat. We've talked before at some length about the fact that LBJ's Great Society programs, whose ostensible purpose was to lift black Americans out of endemic poverty, has had the practical effect of utterly destroying the black American family unit. And that's a point on which Candace Owens has spoken frequently and eloquently. Each time the topic comes up, she says the same thing. If you want to get to the root cause of what ails the black community, it is kids having no father. The epidemic that afflicts black Americans has nothing to do with racism and everything to do with fatherlessness. And is there any better object lesson in the accuracy of that view than the story of the Williams family? Black Americans are told every day, by their Democrat plantation masters and the fake news media alike, that they are systemically disadvantaged and marginalized, that they have no hope of upward mobility except through the large S of the Democrat Party. And if Mr. and Mrs. Williams had believed that load of bullshit, do you think you ever would have heard the names Venus and Serena? No, you would not have. But what does their story tell us about the reality on the ground? For starters, it tells us that if you have a strong marriage between two intelligent, responsible, attentive parents, it doesn't matter if you're raising your family in one of the most impoverished, crime-ridden, drug-infested cities in North America. It tells us that fathers matter. They matter a hell of a lot. Most importantly, it tells us that in the United States of America, when you have a mother and father who love you, who have high expectations for your success, be it academic, athletic, and otherwise, and they're willing to work alongside you to satisfy them, there is absolutely no limitation on what you can achieve for yourself in life. Your race doesn't matter, your sex doesn't matter, your socioeconomic background doesn't matter. This country will happily give you all the riches and all the notoriety that you can earn for yourself. You just have to be willing to do the work. I don't think there's any argument that Serena Williams is the greatest American athlete of the 21st century thus far, and Venus is probably in the top 5 in her own right. I suppose you could make an argument for Michael Phelps, but personally I tend to give more weight to sports that have a full-time touring schedule as opposed to primarily Olympic sports, since the sample sizes are just so much larger. Moreover, both of the Williams sisters have continued playing at a championship level into their late 30s and even past age 40, which no other tennis player of either sex has ever done. Remember the run that Jimmy Connors had to the semifinals of the 91 U.S. Open, when a player reaching the Final Four of a Grand Slam event at age 39 was considered so freakishly improbable there was no chance of it ever happening again? Well, both of the Williams sisters have blown that conventional wisdom out of the water. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, they raised 5 daughters in Compton. All 5 were straight-A students. None was ever in trouble with the law. All of them became productive, self-sufficient members of society. Tragically, senselessly, the oldest stepdaughter was killed in 2003 as an innocent bystander in a gang shooting, but the other 4 stand as living monuments to the power of good parenting. And I think this is where we find Richard Williams at his most enigmatic. I first remember seeing news stories about Venus and Serena when they were about age 9 and 7 respectively, and Richard Williams was perfectly candid about the fact that, yep, I manufactured these 2 girls with the express purpose of turning them into championship tennis players. You hear a man say something like that, and you think you're looking at the absolute worst-case scenario of the pathologically crazy sports parent who just wants to live vicariously through the athletic exploits of his children. And that is exactly how Richard Williams was portrayed in the media at the time. He was never given any credit for the fact that school came before tennis, and if the girls didn't maintain straight A's, they were not allowed to play or even to practice. He was never given any credit for the fact that he wanted them to be kids first and tennis players second. And if that means skipping a day or 2 of practice to go have fun at Disney World, then that's what we're going to do. So, contained within the same human being, we seem to have both extreme polar opposites. On the one hand, you've got a man who breeds children expressly to make them into champion athletes. On the other hand, you've got a loving father who never says a cross word when his kids lose a match, who doesn't want them to think or talk about tennis unless they are on the tennis court, who works just as hard to cultivate their intellect and their self-esteem as he does to cultivate their physical skills. And the moment in the film that best typifies who Richard Williams is, in my judgment, is when a 14-year-old Venus is being offered a $3 million shoe deal before even playing her first pro match, and she rejects it. And without missing a beat, Richard says, okay, that's that. She's not taking the deal. Let's go to dinner. In other words, he and Mrs. Williams had succeeded in raising a daughter who was well-equipped, even at that young age, to make her own major life decisions for herself. So they let her. And they didn't spend one split second questioning the choice she made. In the final analysis, I think this picture is too good and too important to be regarded as just a sports movie. I think it's much more than that. It's a story about poor black people achieving the American dream by dint of talent and hard work. It's a story about a man who never stops believing in the reality of the American dream, even though his early life experiences gave him ample cause for resenting his country. And in that way, it is also a story about forgiveness. Richard Williams forgave the racist bastards who mistreated him as a child, and he didn't allow those experiences to dictate how he viewed the country at large and its people in general. And it takes tremendous strength of character for a man to be that magnanimous. It also, and this is something we're never supposed to talk about, is a story about the intrinsic goodness of Americans, even white Americans. Imagine that. Because how many times were Venus and Serena ever prevented from playing in an event in which they were qualified to play? That number would be 0. If there were some anti-black racists in the tennis establishment at the time, who cares? Did it matter? Did it make any difference? Because today those two women own a combined 30, that is 30, Grand Slam singles titles. So it would seem they weren't held back in any discernible way by the white racist establishment we are supposed to believe exists in this country. Richard Williams is 80 years old now. He no longer makes public appearances. He's had several strokes, and my understanding is that he's not in terribly good shape at the moment, but I hope he was able to see and to fully appreciate the film that they made of his life. And I hope he wasn't watching the Academy Awards when Will Smith's one moment of childish dumbassery ruined what should have been a well-deserved acknowledgement and celebration of his own achievements. If you've seen the picture, I'd be fascinated to know what you thought. If you haven't seen it, well, I highly recommend you do. And we'll leave it there for this week. Thank you very much. Pardon me. Thank you very much for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow and an edifying weekend. I will see you Monday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.